Next at the site, we have Plan B, Architecture and Urbanism, which is an architectural design and research-based practice in New Haven, Connecticut, led by Joyce Shang and Bimal Mendes. Their work applies architectural thinking, analysis, and cartographic methods to strategize and reconfigure social, economic, cultural, and political infrastructures. Plan B is exhibited internationally, including the Yale School of Architecture, the Hong Kong Shenzhen Biennale, the Chengdu Architecture Biennale, and the Ion Earth Summit for World Leaders in Abu Dhabi. Plan B has been the recipient of many awards, including the 2013 AIA Latrobe Prize, a Heinz Research Grant for Advanced Sustainability in Architecture, and the AIA Upjohn Research Grant. Ongoing projects include a spatial planning strategy for the Maldives and the design of a network of children's libraries in Mozambique. Welcome, Joyce and Bimal.
Thank you all, and it's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to be back in Columbus.
I'm Joyce Shang.
And I'm Bimal Mendes.
Together we're the principals of Plan B Architecture and Urbanism, which is based in New Haven, Connecticut. And like many practitioners, we also teach, as Anne and Kelly mentioned, we're sort of a research-based practice. We're both teaching also at Yale, where we're both assistant deans in the school. To that end, we really approach research as a kind of integral part of our practice. And it's very loud. Is this too loud? Feels very echoey. Okay. And I'll say that when we first were selected to be finalists for this, we were thrilled that we had gotten Cummins as our site. I think a lot of it is because there's a sort of sympathetic set of interests and relationships that we have both with Cummins as a corporation and some of the kinds of issues that we sort of independently are doing in our own work.
And this shows a range of, this matrix shows a range of work that we do through our practice, which includes the kind of more conventional building-based projects, but also planning at the national and even global scale, as well as research-based projects, which have a much broader scope of interests and clients.
One of our primary researches has been in the examination of contemporary issues and patterns of global development. In some ways, I think we think of ourselves and our experiences as products of these conditions of global exchange.
So I'm from Sri Lanka, where I was born, but I grew up in Zambia and Zimbabwe, and then came to the US for college. But my architectural formulation was under the auspices of an Argentinian American, Cesar Pelli, who was also a rival of and colleague of Kevin Roach, as well as Rem Koolhaas, who's an Dutch globetrotter.
And for me, I'm Chinese, born in Taiwan as a Canadian citizen, raised and educated in the US, and subsequently had the same kind of Dutch-Argentinian influences.
It's a strange world.
So these research interests that we have, and in some ways what we felt a kind of affinity to Cummins, are in global development are in many ways self-reflexive and self-critical as we kind of consider what is the global footprint of what we do, working in a small place or a small office in New Haven or as faculty at Yale, and the kind of much broader, expansive kind of view.
So these are just a selection of projects, both in our office and work we did for OMA and Cesar Pelli, which again reflects the kind of global connectivity that is predicated by Cummins.
Yeah, and to that end, I think there's a very similar analogy with what Cummins is, a sort of very specific place, a very specific community here in Columbus that has this kind of larger global footprint that literally kind of builds engines that drive the world. So we were sort of very fascinated by that. And some of our work before this that relates to this has to do with this question of a kind of city of 7 billion people and what that starts to mean. And I feel that a similar kind of set of questions as one thinks about one's relationship to the larger world, as one considers what Columbus is as a place and what this company is as a place.
So these are some images from an exhibition we had at the Yale University School of Architecture, where we constructed these large-scale installations, and these kind of diagrams and maps shows the different ways in which we've come to know the world, the kind of transportation networks, the transportation networks, sorry, it's not advancing.
And the way that we're part of this larger network, and these issues of global footprints and issues of bigness, and the way we sort of think systematically through these different networks.
In many ways, there's a kind of similarity there too in terms of how this connects to the way Cummins, if anything, has engineered the world, has also driven the way that we as a humanity have moved through it and come to know it. So this in many ways also connects to this idea of the constructed landscapes, the landscapes that we inhabit, but also the landscape that is around Columbus and the Cummins headquarters in particular. So this kind of inescapable fact was, I think, one of our primary influences, Columbus, Indiana, the Cummins headquarters, and also diving into the archive and mind of Kevin Roach, whose records are at the Yale's University Manuscripts and Archives. So this kind of three-pronged influence has been, I think, one of our kind of key driving forces for the proposal that we're showing today.
So the concept design really emerges from this kind of archaeology and these series of visits that we sort of see, and how we sort of synthesize our own views and interests in relationship to it.
So the first perhaps is the idea of the constructed landscape, where one can see this occurring in multiple scales. This is an old sandworn map of Columbus, Indiana from 1886, and you can already begin to see here the grid of the city, the train lines and transportation networks cutting through it, and then focusing on the lower section of that image, you can begin to see also how that train line that was discussed previously kind of cuts through the site as we know it today. Some historic maps, again from the archives, showing the site, which are bordered by the masking tapes as a cross, showing the train line cutting through it, and some of the existing buildings around it. This is the site largely as we know it today, and you can see how that site has been filled up through the kind of constant densification and urbanization in and around Columbus. These are some of the records from the archives, again showing that kind of process of design and how that design was reflected in the kind of popular press. And you can see that reflection in the Roach-Dinklew proposal. This wasn't the building as we know it today, but a kind of earlier design where the grid of the building aligned with the grid of the city, and the grid of the city aligned with the grid of the kind of larger regional landscape beyond it. That was eventually changed to a more kind of diagonal grid at the 45-degree angle, perhaps echoing the train line before it and the existing building that they preserved as a kind of jewel. But this kind of organizational system pervades through every single aspect of the design, not just at this regional scale, the city scale, the building scale, but even the kind of paving patterns, as well as the kind of the texture or quilt of the carpet that Kevin Roach had proposed for the Cummins headquarters, which was actually never realized, but he wanted to echo the kind of forms and the kind of textures and patterns of this constructed landscape that comprised of the entire broader region beyond Columbus.
So this sense of landscape really starts to become an important sort of driver within the concept, and how it works at the scale, both within the construction of these interior landscapes, as well as within the larger urban situation and organization of Columbus.
So one thing that our design does is it takes on this L-shaped site and intensifies that constructed aspect. Like in this case, it takes a grid of the columns of the pergola or arcade and multiplies that grid, creating another kind of intensification or forest-like quality.
The other kind of important issue that we talk about, or that's part of the site, is this pergola, which really is something that is, in principle, meant to be something that mediates between interior and exterior, or blurs some of those boundaries.
And again, one sees how important this particular design feature was for Kevin Roach, and not just in terms of the way the building was designed, but also the kind of image and identity the building has for the rest of the city. So the pergola is neither inside nor outside. It just has a kind of both and condition. You're both part of the exterior and part of the interior. And these are some of the early sketches from Kevin Roach. But what's really interesting that we found was that this house where his mother lived in Ireland also contained a pergola, and something that he talks about quite a lot. So one can see this aspect of design not just being a kind of fundamental element that he uses, but also perhaps fundamental to his psyche and DNA as an architect. And the kind of similarities between that and the pergola here is quite striking. So one thing we want to do was really address this feature, and not just address it, inhabit it, emphasize it, intensify it, and kind of multiply it. So one thing that our proposal does do, which we'll talk about, is this kind of multiplication of the kind of fundamental elements of the pergola to create both a kind of intensity and immensity, as well as a kind of intimacy, because the scale of the existing pergola is quite vast and can be intimidating when you're in there.
And again, this is sort of this kind of liminal inside and outside, and that relationship between landscape and architecture is so embedded within Columbus, whether in the relationship with Dan Kiley, and certainly in this building, where this building doesn't read without the vines that hug it, almost as if it were this kind of Arcadian rune, like that without the vines and without the kind of columns being hugged by the ivy, we have such a different kind of reading of the building.
I think this aspect was nicely touched upon in the last presentation, but one cannot escape the mirrors when dealing with Kevin Roach, and there's actually some fantastic moments in the Commons headquarters where this is in the corner of the lobby, where you actually get these kind of views that go beyond the building, but also reflections back onto you, and it's almost kind of displaces and destabilizes your grounding, so to speak. But this aspect of using the mirror to bring the outside into the building and also to kind of project the building outwards is something that is part and parcel of Kevin Roach's kind of design methodology. And when one looks at also the kind of earlier design for the building, you can see not just the kind of reflective material in the spandrels, but also that he initially had proposed doing reflective columns in the interior, which actually aren't there today.
But I think that's another image that we already saw, which is this sort of kaleidoscopic effect that then creates this other kind of constructed landscape at a very different scale through the materiality that we are also very fascinated by. But certainly within the Commons corner, which is actually quite tame formally, it's just a kind of rectilinear corner, but just because of the fragmentation of the mirrors, we get this sense of infinite and this liminality where you see reflections of people on the outside and the strips of the grass, and you're sort of completely destabilized in that connection between something that's quite small scale and intimate and something that's quite vast.
So we plan to mirror our columns. And the idea, again, being intensifying the kind of effects of nature as well as the effects of the architectural elements themselves, and they kind of not only proliferate but are redoubled by the mirroring effect. So the kind of combination of these two moves is to create a kind of forest, a forest that also I think Kevin Roach sometimes employs in some of his buildings and designs, in this case the kind of IBM pavilion for the World's Fair in the 1960s. And also acknowledges this kind of contingent relationship between the city and the so-called countryside, or the urban and the rural, that the forest is always not that far away, and how you bring that into the kind of urban environment of the city itself. And bringing, again, referencing this greenery and multiplying it now, but through architectural elements, is something that we think will help both amplify the qualities of this urban threshold, as well as create a new kind of urbanity in that, or through that.
So one of the kind of questions about what makes it more of a kind of forest, we were looking at the actual diagram of the plan. There is this sort of series of staggered columns, and between the hedge and, the paving patterns, there's sort of actually much more of a corridor effect. So it doesn't really work like a pergola. It works much more as if it were a corridor because one can't sort of weave through in a way. So part of what's the kind of arrangement of this takes advantage of the staggered columns as a kind of base that then sort of takes advantage of the diagonals as opposed to the rectilinearity, which is suggested by the paving patterns. So part of the way we would move through this is to kind of critique what is that kind of singular one-point perspective that one seems to get in one reading of the site, and use the addition of these other kinds of fields of columns and the interventions and episodes along this to change that way of moving through that pergola. And that kind of idea or analogy of a forest is very much something that Kevin embraced as well, sort of the idea of a tree and a column. Those columns are like trees and trees are like columns. And so they're inseparable as that forest. So our kind of one of the ideas behind the concept is to introduce this forest of reflective columns, which would therefore amplify the site in a way, whether it's sort of getting slivers of things like the Saarinen Church in one place, and similar to the kind of experience of inhabiting the lobby in that corner where we start to see views of the site reflected in almost this kind of manic or delirious way.
And also, as his images showed, the kind of collapsing of both the natural and the human as one sees oneself reflected on those columns becomes part and parcel of this kind of new and intense atmosphere that we're trying to create. These are views from the exterior, from the outside looking in.
So the other kind of feature is the introduction of these mounds in relationship to that. So these kinds of different topographies that therefore start to become episodes within this. So in this case, as a kind of exterior site, really using landscape devices to create that kind of constructed landscape that plays within that field of reflective columns or that new forest.
And really simple landscape devices, so nothing complex, but elemental forms in which we have constructed the ground.
So you get this reading of it being sort of as much a forest or created landscape within that pergola, as well as this larger, almost the dissolution or the reading of it sort of blurs between building and landscape. So some of the kind of episodes that were then intervened within this start to speak to other ways of kind of questioning or integrating the sociality of the space, whether in something like a kind of conversation pit, which very much for us had to do with sort of drawing again and playing with one of Kevin and playbook in his design for the Miller House, or another kind of introduction of something like a kind of series of outdoor rooms, a kind of amphitheater. And we've already seen the kind of forest. So this is moving along Fifth Street from the entrance. And then as we get to the corner, and turn the corner towards Brown Street, the introduction of an observation mound to give a very different vantage point, one that elevates one, which when you're actually walking there, you're sort of bound so much by the hedges, which are just taller than a person, to give us a kind of the ability to sort of stand a little bit higher and sort of look down both ways, both kind of alleys, the Fifth Street axis as well as the Brown Street axis. Another simple just mound, which are pretty basic, I think, sod and dirt. A kind of denser forest, a sort of hypostyle-like hall where the density gets even larger. To the end, maybe a sort of exterior room of sorts.
And there are three types of columns, or three widths or diameters. So there's like 2-foot columns, 1.5-foot columns, and 3-foot columns. But the real, I think, agency for us is turning the pergola or this kind of colonnade into a public space, into a space that people can inhabit and come to, whether to gaze at the stars at night or have a kind of civic discourse. Because I think right now the pergola is quite grand, immense, and I think, quite immense in scale. And while it has a very strong emphasis on trying to mediate between the city and the building, I think it can be fairly foreboding as a space. So we see this space as having the potential to bring people together. And from what we understand, it's also a fairly popular spot for even young couples to have their photographs taken as they get married. So one could imagine these kind of episodes or moments becoming points of activity, points of fun, points of pleasure, and ways in which one can bring the city into this very kind of intriguing and compelling urban threshold.
Looks like these are a lot of freestanding columns. Did you speak already about the material, how they're made? And I'm sorry.
It's a fairly basic structure. So we've looked at things like flagpoles and light poles, which are very easy to engineer and quite cheap. But I think that detail itself is something we're still considering, given how simple of a structure it is. Its relative anchoring is something that is, I think, fairly easy to do. It's just a question of what kind of detail we want. But it will most likely employ something like a lamp pole or a flagpole, which will consist of 4 prongs that have a small anchoring foundation connected to it. But they can go up to 20 or 30 feet tall. These columns are all 20 feet tall.
But I would also say that I think more than seeing this as a fixed design, I think it's more like a kit of parts that then part of what we would propose would be as much to really specifically develop the kind of programmatic elements and the disposition of this in relationship, obviously, to the budget, but also to what Cummins sort of uses or sees as part of that. And there's a sort of kind of, I guess, it's more about embedding itself within the city rather than a kind of object that one sort of takes out. So it has built into a kind of flexibility.
I thought, maybe I'm misunderstanding. I thought there was a kind of rule about not disturbing the pavers. And so I was thinking if you had already thought through.
We were planning to remove the pavers, and what is there becomes a kind of trace. So you see the trace of the grid within it, and you start to, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So would that be dirt? What would be there without the pavers?
So it would only be wherever there would be any kind of intervention where the pavers were disturbed.
I see.
Again,
Okay.
it takes on, it's more of a kind of a proliferation of subtractions and additions.
I'm a little curious about the actual effect of the reflective material. I mean, I think your project's very interesting, and then certainly I almost feel like there's more than one project here. Just because, for one thing, the colonnade itself is asymmetrical. There's the hedge that's, as you pointed out, head height on one side, but the other side is open to the street and I think would reflect views of the street and what's across the street and wouldn't necessarily have the same intensity of green that you describe. And likewise, to the upper part of the columns, I don't think that they would capture that. Is that an essential part of your project, that it's a forest, meaning green, or forest of vertical elements?
I think it's more the idea of a forest as opposed to it having to be literally green. I think it's more also in the same way that we use the word landscape to describe a kind of forest of workstations and Kevin's innovations within Cummins in that way. There's an intentional use of these kind of more building-like elements, and through its reflectivity, it becomes a way of amplifying these different moments. So we do want it to reflect the street. We would love for it to imagine that it does reflect his own post office across the street. It reflects the view towards Sarn and the other axis as well.
I'm just thinking along the lines of the forest of columns. Is there a rationale, pattern, structuring of that experience, and could they happen outside of the pergola itself?
Certainly. The rationale, as we pointed out before, follows this 45-degree grid that is off the main street and extends the grid of the building, but further multiplies that or makes it even smaller. And it can certainly go beyond the pergola. And while we could do that, we thought we would, again, intensify what's concentrated within it, but have elements that then bleed out into it, which include some of the platforms, some of the mounds, and elements like that. So part of it is trying to contain that forest-like effect within the corridor of the pergola, but have the kind of flexibility for certain elements to go beyond it. But that said, these trees that are beyond it, I think, were very purposely designed and positioned to act as another column that creates that square. So even in the planting pattern and the landscape, the trees already go beyond the pergola as another kind of columnar system.
There seem to be two sizes of columns. Is that right? Or
3, actually.
3? Okay. So the effect is random rather than this kind of hyper-style hall kind of thing. That.
In some cases, like for example, what we're calling the hyperstyle hall has one group of columns for the most part, except in one place it gets switched out with trees. So there's a kind of play that happens with what is a column, what is a tree, and then how big are the columns. But then in other cases, the columns do have a kind of interplay in the sizes, and I think that variability is something that we wanted to kind of test. So this, again, as Joyce mentioned, is not a fixed scheme in the sense that it's not the kind of endpoint of the design, but
No, but I think also the variability was, I think part of it is when you're in that pergola in a lot of spaces, there's a sort of relentlessness that you're trying to break down. And in the same way that there are planted forces that are very regular, it's always the way trees clump and create these, idiosyncratic clumpings or clearings within it that we were sort of seeing as the analogy that we were hoping to replicate. We wanted this to be more of a kind of fun playscape as opposed to another totalizing environment of like inhabiting the grid ad nauseum. So yes, there are things that defy logic within it.
start with one size of columns, and that's,
Okay.
I mean, that was a starting point from which we've kind of slowly.
And just
deviate
curious
from
on the
them and-
model, are these plexi? I mean, these are clear plexi columns, or are they? Oh, okay.
That becomes part of the way you would fabricate these in a pretty straightforward way.
Regarding the episodes, because you started with a nice connection to another space and design that you saw in Columbus, are there other references within the other episodes, either local or global, as you started the,
Yeah, for sure we were looking at things like Dan Graham's work and the way mirrors are used and how they're, like for example, a cut of a triangle and a pretty simple object creates this sense of the infinite, or somebody like Yayoi Kusama's work also, which we felt like that experience also encapsulated a lot of what we felt as a city and an organization, and even standing in the corner of the lobby right here. You get this sort of destabilizing notion where it feels almost cosmological, the kind of space that you occupy. So I think some of the elements reference those kinds of pieces in our mind.
And just to add to that, I think we're also hoping to have that conversation, because we still see this very much as a concept design, to have that conversation with the people at Cummins, for sure, and also the community, and see what kind of, if we are proposing a kind of public space, a space that activates or brings the public into this threshold, what kind of proposals or criticisms they might have. So that's something that we're hoping this thing will be also part of a communication or communicating device.
So you mentioned Dan Graham and also referencing the building itself and its interior, where I think the coming together of the materiality of the reflective surface and the geometry are intrinsically linked. And so in your case, except for that one cube at the back, you have like a lot of cylindrical round forms and round columns. Is the circle form and the cylinder or the column something that's kind of leading the design, or is it coming from an optical study where you want to play with the effect of a reflection on a curved surface versus a faceted effect that is more related to the references you cited?
I think it's all of those things. I think the faceted forms tend to fragment, and there's something really nice about that too, where you're even further disoriented and see multiple views that get collapsed together, whereas the circular forms tend to unify and distort, but not fragment. And I think there was this tendency, I think, on our part to play with that circular form in different degrees, but then we also began to consider, and as you pointed out, that cube or the kind of cubic room are moments that can disrupt that. So this is, in fact, a system that we will want to refine what the rules are, and again, the rules based on some of the feedback we get moving into the next.
But we moved away. We started off with, octagonal columns, which is sort of that sort of study model, and then we tried rotated squares, and then we went to the kind of circular column.
Last question.
Perhaps you answered this in a more theoretical way, but now that you are presenting this here, what would you imagine a citizen of Columbus passing through these spaces, these episodes, these stories, these mirrors? What would you imagine? What would you imagine them imagining or seeing or realizing? What is the experience you would like them to have?
I think there's a kind of range. I think there's one end where, there's a sort of like the intellectual engagement, the engagement with history, that some people might start to see elements and fragments and rhetorical devices that come together. I think the other thing is just like, I like the fun house effect, or there is that part. We were laughing, but also admiring like quotes like Adele, who filmed herself in the Broad, saying that she learned about Yayoi Kusama from like Katy Perry's, Instagram feed, and that's fine, and that's wonderful. And if there's this thing that's just like a kind of trick of mirrors and distortions and refractions that somebody enjoys taking a selfie of, that's great. I totally embrace that aspect. And I think the other aspect about this is, I think in general, our impression of Columbus and this Columbus way that is talked about so often is one that, it's not any one building as a static object, but this larger community and the aggregation of these different buildings together, and the way it's more about the way Columbus comes together. So I think part of that for us in programming this or thinking about this as a kind of way of building community was to see this where the scheme literally itself is woven in and embedded. You can't take it out as a singular piece, but also that all of these different elements become a way of bringing together a community through these kind of public moments of collectivity as a kind of playscape, as opposed to the Roche workspaces within the office building. When we visited here, we saw like people smoke there, and then that was about it. And it was sort of empty without it. And listening to other people, a lot of them just don't use it. They walk on the sidewalk. So it seemed like a wonderful kind of destination because it is such a wonderful space to occupy.
Intrigues them enough to go further into the space. I think that's already accomplishing something, I think.